Hey, everybody. Welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. Coming up in the show today, from the arrest this morning of a former British royal to the resignations and the firings from Wall Street all the way to Hollywood to testimony under oath on Capitol Hill. We are taking a look at the fallout from the release of the latest batch of the Epstein files and who could be next. But first, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the man formerly known as Prince Andrew, was arrested Thursday morning by British police on suspicion of misconduct in public office. Now, authorities haven't released many details, but the DOJ's latest trove of Epstein documents contain new revelations about Andrew's dealings with the late sex offender, Jeffrey Epstein. For years, Andrew has faced repeated allegations of sexual abuse of a minor, all of which he has denied. So for this, I want to bring in NBC News foreign correspondent, Raf Sanchez. Hi, Raf.
Hey, Yasmin, crazy day.
I mentioned, right, former Prince Andrew taken into custody today on his, by the way, 66th birthday. Earlier this month, Raf, the Thames Valley Police, which is the police force in charge of Windsor, said it was looking into a claim that then Prince Andrew shared confidential documents with Jeffrey Epstein. What do we know about these confidential documents and what British police are accusing Andrew of in this investigation?
So British police have released very few details at this stage. Around 8 a.m. local time, they arrested Andrew at his new home in Norfolk in the east of England. He's been living there just a couple of weeks since he was forced out of his royal residence in Windsor, near Windsor Castle. They say he was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office, basically that he abused his public position. That is the extent of what they have said so far. We do know, though, that in this vast trove of documents related to the Epstein case released by the Department of Justice were a series of emails that Andrew appears to have sent to Epstein back in 2010. Now, 2010 is important. Andrew was serving at the time as a trade envoy for the British government. So more than just a member of the royal family, he was actually working on behalf of the British government, trying to drum up trade business around the world. And these emails appear to show that Andrew forwarded Epstein a number of potentially sensitive British government documents related to trade policy. For
folks that don't know, Raf, I want to take them through a little bit of the timeline when it comes to former Prince Andrew and how we got here, right? In 2019, then Prince Andrew stepped away from public duties because of the controversy over his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. That announcement was just days after he discussed Epstein in a BBC interview. In 2022, in February, Andrew reached a legal settlement with Virginia Giuffre for an undisclosed amount after she filed a civil case against him in a New York court, accusing him of sexually assaulting her when she was just 17 years of age. He has repeatedly denied having met her and previously denied that a photograph of the two of them is actually real. Then last fall, Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir was published detailing the allegations against Andrew. And following the publication of that book, Raf, King Charles stripped Prince Andrew of his titles and ejected him from the Royal Lodge. And King Charles released a statement today in which he said the royal family was offering authorities their, quote, full and wholehearted support and cooperation. And then he said, let me state clearly, the law must take its course. This arrest is unprecedented for the British monarchy, which is putting it mildly.
So when we say unprecedented, which is a word we use a lot in the media, but this really is. You have to go back to the 1600s to find anything even remotely comparable. King Charles I was arrested back in 1647. That was literally during the English Civil War. There is nothing comparable in the modern era. The idea that the younger brother of the sitting monarch has been arrested by British police and the king is put in a position where he has to comment on it. The statement was really interesting in a couple of ways. First of all, the king referred to his little brother as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Nothing in that indicated any kind of familial warmth, any even literal recognition that it was his brother he was talking about. And he stressed that the royal family fully supports an independent investigation, that they will cooperate with that investigation however they need to. It is, in some ways, this is obviously a major, major crisis for the royal family. In some ways, the fact that there is now an arrest, that there are active criminal proceedings, at least means that King Charles has a fairly clear explanation for why he's not going to be commenting any further.
I mentioned the woman who accused Andrew, Virginia Giuffre, who died by suicide last year. Her brother and sister-in-law spoke to NBC News Now anchor Hallie Jackson, our colleague, about what Andrew's arrest means to them.
It feels like this surreal moment, a piece of justice that like Virginia has been fighting for this entire time. And I think we're just so proud. We're so proud. We're so freaking proud of our sister right now.
I think the first step here has been taken by the UK, which is amazing. I think there's so much more that needs to be done here.
I want to note, obviously, Andrew's arrest deals with separate issues from the sexual assault allegations made by Virginia Giuffre. But you can't help but wonder if today's action is an indication that there may be more to come for the former prince.
Yeah, it's impossible to say, but the one that they have taken action on today is this fairly discrete issue of suspicion of misconduct in public office. But the fact that they are going down this route today does not mean that they can't go down other routes in future.
One last question for you, Raf. Andrew's not the only one who's getting caught up in this. You now have European investigators that have been combing through the DOJ's latest batch of Epstein files. Is there a possibility that there could be other cases connected to Epstein?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's so interesting is we have thought of the Epstein scandal as a sex abuse scandal, and of course it is. But what is really gaining momentum on the criminal investigation side are these probes into whether powerful people abuse their positions in public office. So Prince Andrew, for starters, but the former British ambassador to Washington, who was fired just a couple of months ago, he is also under a police investigation. Similar theme, emails were found from him to Epstein, potentially containing sensitive data. There is an investigation into the former Prime Minister of Norway on similar grounds, and there is no reason to think that there might not be more probes into other powerful people across Europe.
Raf Sanchez coming to us from the inside of a van in London as he makes his way to Buckingham Palace. Thank you, Raf.
Thank you.
So just after our conversation with Raf, former Prince Andrew has now been released under investigation from a UK police station. That's according to the British police. So the former prince is not the only one who is facing fallout from the release of the Epstein files. There has been a wave of high-profile resignations from Hollywood all the way to Wall Street, and the list goes on. But so far, nobody has been accused of criminal activity. And the Department of Justice has said there's going to be no more prosecutions. So for that, I want to bring in NBC News Chief Capitol Hill Correspondent Ryan Nobles. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, how are you? Yes, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. So after Andrew was arrested, former Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene criticized the president on social media this morning, saying, quote, 0 Epstein-related arrests here in the United States, of course. Mm-hmm. How else are we seeing this news reverberate here in the U.S.? What has been the reaction that you've been hearing so far?
So I think it has the potential to be an earthquake, Yaz. I think that already you're starting to see a lot of American politicians and American thought leaders pointing to the swift action that is taking place in the United Kingdom as an example of what needs to happen here in the United States. The royal family, often thought of as untouchable, as a group of people that are kind of exempt from this type of scrutiny and accountability, I think is what many who have been leading the charge for accountability and transparency in the Epstein files are pointing to as an example of what should happen here.
You know, Ryan, so much of the fallout that we have been seeing from the release of these Epstein files came after lawmakers gained access to the unredacted version of these files, right? And a lot of high-profile folks have had to step down from their gigs, from their jobs, from their companies, from universities, as I mentioned, from law firms. Who are some of those people, and what is their connection, from what we understand, to Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, maybe the best example is Kathy Rumler, who was the former Obama White House chief counsel, somebody that was very connected to the Obama family in Democratic politics, and who was also a high-powered lawyer for Goldman Sachs, has been in that job for a long time. She pops up over and over again in the Epstein files, served as some level of legal counsel to Jeffrey Epstein, but also appeared to have some sort of a personal relationship with him. And she stepped down from that job at Goldman Sachs. But she's not the only one. You have Tom Pritzker, who is the executive chair of Hyatt Hotels, who was forced to step down. And then Casey Wasserman of the high-profile Hollywood talent agency. Wasserman faced all kinds of serious pressure from some of the very high-profile people that they represent. The best example being from Chappell Roan, the high-profile pop star who said that she was no longer going to be represented by Wasserman. And while there are certainly people losing their jobs, there are two things that we haven't seen happen yet, Yaz. And that's first, any political consequence for someone popping up in the Epstein files. We've seen members of the Trump cabinet, Howard Lutnick of being the best example, who has, at least at the very least, mischaracterized his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, still in his job. We obviously have the president himself. And then the second part of it is that we haven't seen any criminal accountability for it. There have been no further prosecutions. And while the attorney general kind of waved at the idea during her tense hearing on Capitol Hill that they're still exploring possible investigations and that further prosecutions can happen, there's been no evidence of any kind of tangible movement in that direction. And that's something that the survivors truly believe needs to happen.
Well, and it seems like Congress recognizes that, right? Because in one respect, you have the DOJ saying, okay, this is it, right? We're moving on from here. Whereas Congress is like, no, we are digging deeper into these investigations. This week, you had billionaire Les Wexner, the former CEO of Victoria's Secret, testifying before the House Oversight Committee. He had been subpoenaed because his name appears in the Epstein files more than 1,000 times. He has denied any wrongdoing, maintaining that he cut ties with Epstein back in 2007. But take us inside your reporting. What did we learn from Wexner, his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein as well? And we know, obviously, the Clintons are coming next week, but is there a possibility we could see more folks called to the Hill to testify because of their ties to Epstein?
I'll answer your last question first, and that is absolutely yes. I think that there is going to be a steady, long line of people that are called to testify. I think that Kathy Rumler, for instance, who we just talked about, is somebody that Democrats have already said that they want to hear from, and Republicans have not turned down the idea of perhaps hearing from her. So I think that's an absolute possibility. But going back to the Wexner testimony, I'm very interested to see that transcript. They're going to release the transcript and the full video of it. But he answered questions for more than 6 hours. And the members of Congress that were in the room said that he answered every single question. I think there was some effort on his part to try and distance himself from the awful things that Jeffrey Epstein did. He certainly, as we saw in his opening statement, said that he was duped by a con man. But I'm interested when that transcript comes out to kind of read between the lines behind some of the very specific questions that the congressional investigators had for him. Because I think what's interesting is nothing really on its own is a smoking gun. But when you see one piece of information and then you connect it to another piece of information.
It's like a puzzle.
Exactly. You know, I think that's the Howard Lutnick equation, right? Howard Lutnick goes on a podcast and emphatically states that he cut ties with him because he was horrified by Jeffrey Epstein in 2005. But then there's a trove of emails that show him having a conversation with him in 2008, actually traveling to Epstein Island with his family. And so I think that all these things piece together, and the Wexner deposition could lead to a deposition of someone else, which could lead to a deposition of someone else tied in with what we already know in the files. And I think what's most frustrating for those who have called for Epstein transparency from the very beginning is that there were clear investigative lines that prosecutors should have explored at the very beginning of this controversy that for whatever reason they chose not to.
So the other folks that are going to be testifying, as I mentioned, former President Bill Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that's happening next week, I believe over 2 days. They asked to make it public. It's going to be public. Give us a preview. What do we think is going to happen there?
So it'll be public after the fact. As far as we know, it'll still be a closed-door deposition to start, but eventually all of the video and the transcript, which will be released, which is something the committee has done a very good job of doing and actually doing on a pretty short timeline. But listen, here's the thing, and I think this is something that Democrats on the committee, given the fact that they've asked for Kathy Rumler to come forward, seem to understand. There is no getting around party affiliation when it comes to the Epstein controversy. And if you are going to be very critical of Donald Trump and his cabinet and the names that have popped up in the Epstein files that happen to be associated with Republicans, there needs to be just as much pressure put on Democrats and people affiliated with Democrats in the Epstein files. And there's no one, I think, that is more prominent, that is known as a Democrat than Bill Clinton in the Epstein files. So that's not to say that he's guilty of anything. That's not to say that he's been accused of anything. Republicans admit that as well. But the fact that there's someone in these files who's been mentioned so often and clearly had a relationship with him, and if you're trying to uncover every single possible stone in this investigation, it makes sense that he comes in and answers questions. And then ultimately, then that opens the door to whether or not the Howard Lutnicks and the Donald Trumps of the world also will be forced to answer questions. Yes.
I'm glad you said that, because that's exactly what was on the tip of my tongue, which is, well, then are they going to call in the President of the United States to answer questions under oath in front of the House Oversight Committee?
There was a moment last week on Capitol Hill where James Comer came out and gaggled with all of us. And I asked him directly this question. Do you think calling in a former president sets a precedent? And could that impact Donald Trump? And his exact words were, of course it sets a precedent. Everything we do sets a precedent. So the Republicans on the committee, the chairman of the committee, are not even trying to reject this idea that perhaps it could lead to a situation where Donald Trump is subpoenaed or be forced to answer questions. Now, in the same breath, they also say he answers questions about this all the time. Whenever somebody in the press asks him questions about it.
Yeah.
If you're Robert Garcia and you're the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, and you're looking at the polls that show Democrats have a real possibility of winning back the majority in 2026, who's the first name that you're going to put on your subpoena list once you get that subpoena power?
Ryan Nobles, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right, that is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yazin Vasugian. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, subscribe. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.